Oh, folks, today's a special day. It's an historic occasion. In fact, it's so important, I made sure to pronounce the full "an" in front of historic to let you know how fancy I am. You see, today we're concluding our look back at the films of 2019 by honoring the true masterpieces of cinema. And to each of the winners of this prestigious occasion, we'll be sending this gift basket filled with the finest wines and cheeses.
Aaron, that's a bag of garbage.
Of course it's a bag of garbage! Everybody knows this is garbage! Everyone knows this is a sham! Why am I even pretending to go along with any of this? You all saw the title card of this! These films are terrible! Why are we even wasting the good backdrop on this? Here are the worst films of 2019! Number 10, Cats. Oh, I'm sure some of you are surprised to see this one this low on the list. I know that for many people out there, this was the breakout crappy film of the year, and I'll admit, in the first half hour of the film, I was indeed going back and forth between laughing at how bad it was and legitimately uncomfortable and horrified by how disturbing the CGI was, how poor the story structure was, and the humanoid cockroach vor. I didn't stutter. But after the first half hour, the shock value kind of wore off and I found myself just bored watching a bad musical. People describe this as being one of the craziest things they've ever seen, and I wish it was crazier. I wish this was as weird as people describe, so that way it would at least keep my attention. Hell, this isn't even the craziest musical starring humanoid animals I've ever seen. Go watch Rock and Rule, then come back and talk to me about weird. At least that one has a kick-ass soundtrack. Number 9, The Kitchen. Who would have thought that one of the worst comic book movies of the year would be the only one not featuring superheroes? The Kitchen is an interesting idea for a story about the wives of 3 mob members who have to figure out what they're going to do when their husbands get arrested, and they end up taking over the city's organized crime and running the mob themselves. Unfortunately, as interesting as that idea is, what we got was one of the most amateurish films I've seen all year. This is from a first-time director, and hey, I hope they don't get discouraged from this because you never want to see someone fail. But wow, this feels like someone's first film. Characters deliver lines with the pacing of a middle school play. Nobody ever looks like they know where they're supposed to be standing, and nothing is ever really explained. How did these 3 women become the head of the mob? Well, they took some money from someone, gave it to someone else. Now they're mob bosses. Okay. They say they're doing good things for the community. What exactly are you doing? And how are you doing it? I constantly had to rewind the movie because this story is put together so poorly, I felt like I was blacking out and missing full scenes. Nope, it's just not a good movie. Number 8, Glass. Nearly 20 years ago, M. Night Shyamalan made Unbreakable, a movie that brought us a groundbreaking look at the idea of superheroes in the real world at a time right when the superhero movie craze was beginning. And over those last 2 decades, superhero movies and comics have grown exponentially in pop culture and especially in films. And yet somehow, M. Night's understanding of them just went in reverse with a brick on the gas pedal. Listen, I'll admit, part of me hates that this film constantly talks about comic books in a way that feels like they think they're really smart and clever, but if you know anything about comics, you know they're not. But even looking at this movie not as a comic fan, but just as a film goer, this is a joke. This film has to keep coming in over and over again, explaining to the audience what a comic book is. Which isn't just repetitive, it makes this film feel like it came from a time capsule. M. Night, do you know what the #1 movie-making property of the last decade has been? And if you were waiting to see Bruce Willis return to continue his story from Unbreakable, yeah, keep on waiting because despite the fact that this movie only has to balance 3 characters, they drop him completely from the majority of the runtime. And of course, it's an M. Night film, so it has to have a twist. And this one has 3 twists, one right after the other, and every single one of them makes the movie worse. I have to move on to number 7, but I assure you, if you let me, I could go off on this thing for about an hour because almost every line of dialogue is worth stopping to comment on how bad it is. Number 7, Dark Phoenix. Speaking of the superhero genre that has dominated Hollywood for 2 decades now, Fox's X-Men movies were some of the first to really kick off this craze. They were instrumental in helping to change the landscape of movies as we know it, and this year, that franchise came to a close with the final film under Fox, Dark Phoenix. A film that made us look back at the past 2 decades and realize, oh, maybe there's a reason that half of these are bad. Maybe all the good ones were just a fluke. I'll admit, one of the main reasons this gets so low on the list is simply because it just feels like nobody cared in this thing. This is your final film, and you decide not only to retell the plot of X3, which many people consider to be your worst film, but you even got the same writer and director of that movie to come back? And rather than rewriting that storyline to be more like the comics, you decide to keep the storyline exactly the same as it was in X3, but you also added in the stuff from the comics, even though those two things don't go together at all. Then on top of that, you throw in aliens as the villain who feel like they have no reason to be there, no personality, aren't memorable in any way, shape, or form, and honestly feel unimportant even as villains when you've got the titular Dark Phoenix just sitting right over there. Why do we even need these dollar store scrolls to complicate matters more? And even though I like several of the X-Men movies, I had some shared problems with pretty much all of them, and those problems are front and center in this movie like they've never been before. We need to fill in this roster with some additional mutants. Well, do we pick any of the dozens of really cool mutants from the comics that we haven't used yet? No, let's get the most generic jobber background mutants you could possibly imagine. There seems to be no real team dynamics or time spent exploring half the characters in this film, and when they do focus on these characters, it makes you wonder if they even know who they are. I mean, for God's sakes, this movie ends with Holy Man, Kurt Wagner, going on a murder rampage, and we're supposed to applaud it? And of course, you can't ignore that several actors in this film are suffering from the worst case of senioritis I've ever seen. They know this is the last film, and they wanted to be done with this franchise long ago. So they are just counting down the seconds until they can get off the set, and it could not be more obvious. Number 6, The Curse of La Llorona. The Conjuring film franchise had something really unique going for it. For a while, it looked like it was going to be one of the most successful shared cinematic universes in movie history. But now, stop. Just stop. It's over. Put it away. No one wants this anymore. La Llorona is what people who hate horror films picture when they think of horror films. It is nothing but a string of jump scares, just things screaming at the screen, and it always happens after such a long build-up that everyone in the audience figured out it was coming long ago. Throw in some of the worst child characters I've seen in any horror film, characters who felt like they only existed to make the situation worse, and there is pretty much nothing salvageable about this movie. I mean, if you guys really want to know how bad this movie is, there's a La Llorona theme park ride, and that does a better job of creating a scary La Llorona experience.
Brady's pass, it's intercepted.
There we go. Next up is Rambo Last Blood. Now, before we get into our discussion of this film, let me just go ahead and say, out of all the films on today's list, our review of Rambo Last Blood definitely got the most negative reaction. A lot of people said that I didn't know what I was talking about in that review, and after going back and looking at it, they do have a point. There is definitely something in that review that I was way off on. I said that this film was incredibly prejudiced against the people of Mexico. So much so that there's a scene in that film where they're approaching the Mexican border, and I said they filmed it like they were approaching the Death Star. At which point, I began to hum the Duel of Fate song from Star Wars Episode 1. But that doesn't actually have anything to do with the Death Star, so instead what I should have done was hum the Imperial March from Star Wars Episode 4. I'm sorry everyone, I was way off on that. That was totally uncalled for. My mistake. Everything else I said about this movie is 100% accurate. This film is trash. Rambo Last Blood feels like it has zero purpose for existing other than to make old people afraid of Mexico. Rambo, after years of digging murder tunnels under a farm, crosses paths with the cartel and then proceeds to slaughter these walking cardboard cutouts, and that's kind of the only reason this movie exists. These are the worst villains I've seen in a movie in a long time because they have zero personality, zero depth. They don't even have any dialogue that isn't related to the bad things they're doing. The only lines out of their mouths are, "Kill them. I'll kill you. If you try to escape, I'll kill you." They only exist to be things for Rambo to murder, which he indeed does, with a level of savagery and hate that it almost makes you wonder if the director was enjoying these scenes a little too much. Rambo won't just kill someone, he'll take the time to cut off their head and then drive around with it. He won't just let someone fall on a pit of spikes, they'll fall on the pit of spikes, impale themselves through the head so that there is literally zero way that they could still be alive, and then he'll proceed to shoot their lifeless corpse with a machine gun, because murdering them once wasn't enough to satisfy this filmmaker's hate bar. Listen, I'm not saying that you can't have a mindless action film, but you have to give me something to be mindlessly actiony against. Otherwise, I'm just watching a character stab things and scream for an hour. This movie almost feels like someone watched the ending of Taxi Driver and didn't understand, oh, this is a disturbing scene, and we're not supposed to like Travis Bickle. Number 4, Hellboy. Oh, I remember when I thought this was going to be my worst movie of the year. I was far happier not knowing that there were 3 worse films out there. This movie somehow wins the award for being the most random film of the year and the most boring. This movie has awful pacing and editing that jumps from one crazy thing to the next with no introduction to anything, making a story that even when you understand what is happening, feels like you don't. But that could also be partly thanks to the horrible sound editing, something I almost never have to complain about, but I have to bring it up here because I swear I could not understand half of what anyone was saying in this film. And with such a colossal clusterfudge of a story loaded with monsters and special effects, at least you'd think it'd be engaging in some way. And yet, this was a snooze fest. I'm not kidding you, when I saw this in theaters, 2 people fell asleep and started snoring loudly from different directions in the theater, and nobody woke them up because their snores were more entertaining than this film. Number 3, The Fanatic. You all know why this movie is so bad. Next to Cats, this was the big bad breakout star of the year, with reviews for it going viral on the internet, and the mere existence of the film practically becoming a meme in and of itself. But unlike Cats, yes, this one is actually that bad. When I can look at the offensive portrayal of a man with a mental condition by John Travolta and say that's not even in the top 5 worst things about the film, that should tell you everything that you need to know. I often say a movie feels like it doesn't know what it wanted to be, but I would gladly take every single time I have ever used that description back right now, so that I could take all of that and concentrate like a laser beam at this film. Is John Travolta's character Moose the villain? Is the celebrity he's stalking the villain? Are they both villains? Are they both misunderstood? This movie jumps back and forth between those options multiple times within the same scenes. Because of that, you never once know who you're supposed to be rooting for, and because anyone who ever gets close to feeling like a villain pulls back before they become too much of a threat, you never feel any tension. And yes, there are tons of poor decisions in the story structure and the dialogue and the score, but, well, I can't complain too much about all that because I know what's coming up in the bottom 2. And compared to this year's Bomb in the Barrel, this movie felt like Hitchcock. Wait. Please tell me no one's going to take that quote out of context and put it on the box. Number 2, The Haunting of Sharon Tate. A lot of you might not have heard of this film, and there's a very good reason for it. It's because after being shopped around Hollywood for an entire year and failing to find anyone who wanted to release it, the only places in 2019 it could find distribution was in Portugal and Russia, where it still did so poorly that in Russia, in its second weekend of being released, it only sold about 1 ticket per theater. I don't mean per screen, by the way. I mean per theater for the entire weekend. So I'd like to take this moment to say thank you, Box Office Mojo. You really helped put a number on how bad this film is. So, you know the story of Sharon Tate, the young upcoming actress who was murdered by Charles Manson's cult while she was pregnant with her first child? Truly one of the most tragic stories in the history of Hollywood. So if someone came to you and said that they were going to take that story and make a movie about it, but was going to be a horror story about ghosts, you'd probably think that was a terrible idea. And you'd be right, it was! But now imagine taking that idea and giving it the worst production quality and story structure of any film I saw this year. And you can understand why it hits all the marks to be right next to the bottom. This entire movie doesn't even feel like a movie. It feels like there was no script and instead Hilary Duff and her friends were just hanging out one day and said, "Hey, wanna make a movie? I got my phone here. We can just start recording. We'll figure everything out as we go." The camera work is so bad, I literally had to stop watching at one point because I was getting motion sickness. The characters have accents that just come and go as they please. The premise changes from one moment to another. How do you do that? How do you have a film where at one moment it's an Exorcist possession style film, then nope, it's a regular slasher movie, then it's an Amityville haunting film, then back to slasher, then it's a government conspiracy, then it's Satan because why not? Then it's an alternate history where events were changed thanks to psychics? This is a movie that is so sloppy, it has the conclusion of the film happen halfway through it, only to reveal that was a dream. Then, they just do it all again later, after another dream fake out. This film made history on this channel as being the first film I ever gave a 1 out of 10 to. But it wouldn't be the last. Yes, 2019 was so terrible, we had 2 1 out of 10s, and so I now present to you the worst film of the year. Laquisha. Now, just like Cats and just like the Fanatic, Laquisha is another film from last year that got famous for how bad it was. Except that unlike those two, this got famous just for the trailer because nobody wanted to actually watch the movie itself. Nobody wanted to find out if it was actually as bad as that trailer implied. And I'm here to tell you, no, it's worse. Whatever you thought this film was going to be when you saw that trailer, it somehow topped it. Laquisha is a movie all about a white man who gets a radio show by pretending to be a black woman, and I feel like I can stop talking about the movie right there. Yes, our protagonist Joe gets a job doling out advice on the radio by creating the persona of Laquisha, a horrendously stereotypical and offensive caricature. And you might think that this movie would have some sort of a conscience or self-awareness of how bad that premise is, and maybe they'll end up trying to turn your expectations around and make this a film about someone not realizing how incredibly racist they're being, and that this will be a journey of self-discovery and all about overcoming your own bigotries. Nope! It's all about how Joe is totally right for doing this, and if you have a problem with it, then it's your fault. This movie isn't just bigoted and ignorant, it's proud of its ignorance. The only motivation that you could have to keep watching this film is to see how much deeper they could possibly dig their own grave without even realizing it. This is a film where Joe believes that the only thing he did wrong was simply lying to everyone. Not, the racism. And in the end, not only does he not learn anything, nor is he punished for this, he gets additional rewards for his behavior. And the only time anyone in this film actually calls Joe out for what he did, he just replies, "Yeah, well, what about you?" At which point the person goes, "Oh, yeah, I guess you're right," and proceeds to sleep with Joe because remember, if you're mad at Joe, then you're the one that's wrong, and you should really give Joe a reward to make up for it. Oh, and did I mention that the actor who plays Joe is also the writer and director of this film? This movie could not be any more of a weird power trip fantasy for him if his character was made out of gold. Now, some of you might think that I'm exaggerating this filmmaker's behavior. And if you think that, I'd just like to remind you that when this filmmaker saw the backlash the trailer was getting, he defended himself by posting a photo of himself with Marlon Wayans. At which point, Marlon Wayans replied, "This is bullshit, I don't know who this is." I repeat, this filmmaker was accused of being racist. He replied, "I'm not racist, I know a black guy." At which point the guy in the photo with him said, "I don't know you." You can't make this level of stupid up. This was the brilliant mind behind this movie. And you know what the cherry on top is? It's that even if you look beyond the racism and sexism, which you really shouldn't do, it feels like that's all you need to make this a bad film, but if you somehow manage to do that, it's still terrible. Camera work that can't even follow beginner level lessons. Bad special effects in a film that didn't even need special effects. Poor audio editing in scenes that was clearly done in post to try and fix mistakes in scenes that didn't even need to be in the movie. So rather than cutting the scene out because you made a mistake, you tried to ADR lines in that made the scenes worse. A score that sounds dated even by 90s sitcom standards, and a script that almost feels like they didn't know you could go back and make changes after you had written something down. There is no amount of time in the world that would allow me to complain about everything wrong in this film. And I say that as someone who talked for over 40 minutes about it in our review and immediately realized how much I forgot to include in there. So for being so bad that no amount of words can truly capture it, of course, this is the worst film of 2019. Well, there you have it. Those are our top 10 worst movies of the year. And now that we've finished our annual cleansing, I can get back to seeing all the good films that 2020 has to offer. Oh, that's right, it's January. Well, guess I'll just crawl into a hole and die now. While I do that, you guys check out the playlists that are popping up on the screen right now. One has our reviews of all the worst films of the year, and one has our reviews of all the good films of the year. Go ahead and check that one out too. It'll remind you that there's still hope and joy and wonder in the world. Bye, everyone.